Welcome to the Shepherd and Wedderburn webinar on harnessing greed in negotiations.
It is the fourth in a series of webinars looking at the impact of specific emotions on people during negotiations and on the process of negotiation itself.
I am Lee Dupont, a director in the Commercial Disputes Division of Shepherd and Wedderburn, and I am joined today by my colleague, Freya Kenny, a trainee in our department.
Mahatma Gandhi famously said that there's a sufficiency in the world for man's need, but not for man's greed. Can the same be said of greed in a negotiation, that greed provokes an insufficiency?
That strikes me as being more likely to be true in a zero-sum game scenario than if negotiators are using an integrative negotiation approach.
Is this looking at the impact of greed in negotiations too simplistically, too mechanically? The root causes of greed often lie in the unconscious mind and are complex. However, like anger, greed can have a very significant impact upon others. Even if you don't consciously perceive the impact of decisions driven by greed on a negotiation, your counterparty will.
So is the theme of today's webinar going to be that when it comes to negotiations, that Gordon Gekko got it wrong, greed is not good, it isn't right, and it doesn't work?
I'm not so sure. Negotiations are often partially or wholly zero-sum games, where one person's gain is another's loss. Surely the drive to achieve an objective or maximise your gains is an aspect of greed, and it's a necessary aspect of any negotiation, isn't it?
Well, as ever with this series, we'll explore what the scientific research has to say on the subject instead of speculating. So let's dive into our topic today and find out what impact greed has on negotiations.
So have you ever considered what greed is? Interestingly, the earliest recorded use of the noun greed is from the early 1600s in the writings of Simon Graham, a Franciscan friar. The English word stems from Germanic root word meaning hungry, voracious, or eager to obtain. But the concept of greed has been narrated for millennia. In fact, the world's earliest surviving literary work, the Epic of Gilgamesh, dates back to about 2100 BCE and explores a king's insatiable desire for power and his hoarding of resources. Such tales can be found scattered throughout human history from many ancient civilizations. Every major religion advocates a greed is bad message, but philosophers have taken a much more nuanced approach to the emotion. Philosophical conceptions of greed are varied. They range from Plato and Aristotle, who framed greed as being harmful, resulting in an inability to distinguish between needs and desires, and an inhibitor to happiness, to Thomas Hobbes, who argued that greed is an innate human condition, and that man is inherently selfish and motivated by a restless desire for power and goods to ensure survival. This supports, in rather unflattering terms, biological and evolutionary perspectives on greed. In contrast, Jean-Jacques Rousseau saw greed as a social rather than human construct, something that was born out of the development of civil society and therefore a corrupting product of society and ownership. As you can see, this theme of greed as a negative influence upon society is recurrent. Across timeframes and genres, greed is framed in moral or cultural terms as bad. And for each of us, this is our earliest contact with the concept of greed. As children, we are repeatedly exposed to the idea that greed is bad. Take, for example, stories like Aesop's fable, Killing the Goose That Laid the Golden Egg, and The Fisherman and His Wife, or legends such as King Midas and His Golden Touch. And of course, today's cartoon characters such as Scrooge McDuck and Montgomery Burns. It is not a coincidence that we do not encounter literary characters that seek to glamorize greed in children's stories.
By contrast, economic theory often regards greed as a positive influence and a key principle of economic theory, that rational people should focus on maximising their personal outcomes, which, from an economic perspective, will then benefit not only the individual but also society as a whole, as it will lead to activities that promote economic growth. Greed is, therefore, seen as an important driver of economic growth and prosperity. Thus, Ayn Rand famously wrote, "Capitalism has been called a system of greed, yet it is a system that raised the standard of living of its poorest citizens to heights no collectivist system has ever begun to equal, and no tribal gang can conceive of." The foundation of Miss Rand's position was the thinking of a number of Renaissance economists. For example, Bernard Mandeville's Alliance of Pride and Greed theory in the 17th century argues that people's selfish behaviour and vices unintentionally promote a thriving economy and social order. Similarly, Adam Smith introduced the concept of invisible hand, which puts forward that individuals acting in their own self-interest actually benefit society as a whole, leading to both innovation and efficiency. However, the flip side of this economic worldview arguably resulted in the tulip mania of 1637 and every financial bubble since, including the 2009 financial crisis and Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme.
So we come back to the question of whether greed is necessarily bad. Greed stems from a biological and evolutionary imperative, the drive to accumulate more of what is needed to survive in times of scarcity to promote self-preservation. There are certainly instances where what may be seen as greedy behavior is good for a society, for example when it generates a surplus of goods. Fundamentally, greed is a survival trait that each of us possesses. Psychologists approach the issue differently, though. They do not see this as an issue of morals, but more as a motivational orientation that predicts behavior in economic and social decision-making contexts. For example, two Dutch economic and social psychologists, Marcel Zelenberg and Zeger Brueggemans, conducted a review of various leading studies on greed and helped to develop a scale to measure greed. They regard greed as a normal human trait, which is about getting more of what you want. They found that whilst people may differ in how greedy they are, these individual differences in acquisitiveness, or dispositional greed, are stable over time and can in fact be reliably assessed so as to predict human behavior. Zelenberg and Brueggemans noted that economists in particular are amongst the biggest proponents of greed, and that greed is beneficial for others in society. Basically, being greedy or self-interested is thought to lead first to the acquisition of wealth, then to surplus production. A trickle-down effect spills over and then benefits society as a whole. Certainly many empirical studies have shown that so-called greedy people perform better, work harder, and earn more in a variety of tasks. Being greedy has also been shown to manifest in better time usage, increased progress, as well as a motivation for achieving goals, accomplishments, persistence, personal growth, and other self-improvements. So who wants to be greedy now?
I think I do.
But we should add that Professors Zelenberg and Brueggemann classed those traits as the good aspects of greed. They also found that the bad aspects of greed reflected situations where dispositional greed inhibited pro-social behaviors. For example, a lab study showed that greed was linked to corruption and a potential to undermine social structures, and another study confirmed that dispositional greed was the strongest predictor of hoarding behavior during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Ultimately, greed can be viewed through many different lenses, 3 of which we have identified. So, it can be viewed morally or religiously, where it is often considered to be a vice and harmful to others; economically, where self-interest is seen as positive for society as a whole, but unchecked greed can lead to corruption and inequality; or it can be viewed psychologically, where it is a natural human emotion or driver that is measurable, affects behavior, and widely varies depending on the individual and other circumstances. Obviously, we'll be approaching greed most often from the psychological perspective for the rest of this webinar. Clearly, greed is hard to pin down and separate out from other closely related concepts such as self-interest, materialism, and envy, but we will be taking the dictionary definition of greed as our benchmark, which Merriam-Webster defines as a selfish and excessive desire for more of something, such as money, than is needed. And, whether we like it or not, we will consider greed whilst accepting the fact that we all have an inherent capacity to be greedy. So, having considered the nature of greed, let us now turn to how greed affects a person or organisation's negotiating behaviours. The driving aim of a negotiating party should always be to advance their particular interests. As a result, an element of self-interest is an inherent part of any negotiation. Surprisingly, given the connection between self-interest and greed and the volume of psychological literature on this, there have been surprisingly few empirical studies done on the impact of greed in general, or in the context of negotiations. This is likely because of difficulties in not only defining greed, but also in measuring its impact. For example, a number of research papers in the noughties found that greedy people displayed more unethical behaviours, and in particular, were more likely to withhold information from others in a negotiation setting. In short, greed's impact on a negotiation included more lying to achieve a desired outcome. However, these studies relied on inferred behaviour rather than measurable greed, and it was remarkably difficult to distinguish between multiple motivators. The study noted the overlap between greed, need, and self-interest. As a result, those earlier findings were important for the links identified, but the overall conclusion was that there was no clear evidence of a relationship between greed and unethical behaviour. In 2016, Dr. Terry St-Gens, a social psychologist at the Tilburg Institute for Behavioural Economics Research, published the results of an in-depth research which included a number of empirical studies. In 2015, Dr. St-Gens had developed a method using 7,500 participants called the Dispositional Greed Scale, or DGS, for reliably measuring greed as a stable personality trait. This scale was found to be a reliable means of measuring what they termed dispositional greed, which captures stable individual differences rather than momentary behaviour, and predicting its influence on behaviour at a later time. Dispositional greed was defined for the DGS and related studies as individual differences in the tendency to always want more and to never be satisfied. These studies demonstrated that differences in dispositional greed could be used to predict other types of behaviour. For example, those who scored highly for dispositional greed correlated with behaviours that included self-interest, a desire for materialism, and envy. They found that greedy negotiators were more likely to impose unfair offers in both dictator and ultimatum games, and were inclined to over-harvest in a forest management game. Dr. St-Gens then went on to design an empirical study to discover the extent greed leads to unethical behaviour in a corruption game. The participants in the game were 172 first-year college students who took part in return for course credit. The participants were asked to imagine a situation where an association had lost €200 down a drain pipe and could only be retrieved by a plumber company. The participants were tasked by the association to choose the most favourable plumber company out of 10, all of whom had placed an offer that only the participant knew. Each offer had two parts: the price that the association would have to pay for their services, and a sum which the participant would receive if they picked that company. The game was constructed so that more money the participant received, the higher the cost to the association. In the best case scenario, the association would be charged €20 with no bribe for the participant, and in the worst, it would be charged €200 with the participant receiving a bribe of €144. It was made clear to the participants that, at the end of the study, they would randomly select one participant who would get paid according to that participant's choice. After each participant had made their choice, they were asked to complete the GGS. Of the 172 participants, 78 accepted a bribe, with an average amount of €70. The results of the corruption game demonstrated that the higher a person scored on dispositional greed, the higher the bribe that they accepted. These also suggested that those who are greedy were more susceptible to bribes due to lower self-control. The mediating factor of self-control on dispositional greed was further tested in a second study. The results suggested that greedy people were more likely to engage in unethical behaviour because they had stronger desires and less self-control. It is, of course, possible that an alternative explanation is that greedy individuals simply do not think about the consequences of their behaviour. There are studies that associate greed with having tunnel vision or being very goal-oriented, which suggests that greed arises when a person becomes so focused on attaining their goal that they fail to consider the consequences of their behaviour on others.
So in contrast to economists' view of greed as a positive driving force for economic development, current psychological research strongly suggests that, whilst not necessarily bad, greed is at least associated with negative behaviours. In fact, Dr. St-Gens' research shows that individuals who score highly for dispositional greed will 1. Experience less guilt following unethical behaviour, 2. Anticipate feeling positive emotions after exploiting others, and 3. Show reduced sensitivity to moral and ethical norms. This matters. Put differently, greedy negotiation behaviour often does not feel unethical to the person engaging in it. It feels justified. As a result, in real-world negotiations, greed tends to overshadow and distort rational thinking, so that individuals or organizations experiencing higher levels of greed may encounter a number of cognitive biases. The first is illusionary superiority bias. This is where a greedy negotiator overestimates their ability to extract maximum value, which leads to unrealistic demands. It can also manifest in the adoption of aggressive bargaining strategies, which seek to maximize gain, or in other words, getting every scrap on the table. It occurs where there is heightened sensitivity to gains and a reduced sensitivity to losses, which helps explain why greedy negotiators often underestimate risk. In practice, this means that greedy negotiators frequently pursue marginal gains while discounting the probability of negotiation breakdown. This approach can, and frequently does, end a negotiation prematurely. The second bias impacted by greed is escalation of commitment bias. Once greed takes hold, a negotiator may double down on an unreasonable position, refusing concessions even when the rational approach would be to compromise. This is basically where a party pursues a win-at-any-price policy. Greedy negotiators are also less easily satisfied with equitable deals and are more willing to risk a stalemate rather than accept what they perceive to be a good enough outcome. Any offers that are made will usually be very self-serving, one-sided, and will tend to prioritize self-gain over a fair compromise. Third, greed often promotes present bias. A greedy negotiator often prioritizes immediate gains at the expense of long-term value. This is a shift from value creation to value claiming, where the greedy party will go for a big win now rather than consider the mutual benefits of a longer-term commercial relationship. It leads to the exploitation of counterparts and the sacrifice of goodwill, trust, and/or respect, rather than the building of connections. Ultimately, this approach reduces trust and potential future cooperation between parties, and frequently results in the business relationship being terminated at the next opportunity. Fourth and last is a reduction in ethical sensitivities. The studies demonstrated that greed tends to increase ethical lapses. This may involve behaviors such as bluffing, misrepresentations, or outright lies, deception, and dishonesty. This type of behavior also reduces post-deal satisfaction and cooperation, even when undiscovered, since how a counterparty feels about a deal negotiated after they have walked away from the negotiating table is often more important than the terms of the deal itself. Greedy behavior also affects the negotiator's counterparty. The counterparties may react to low ultimatum offers, perceiving them as unfair, resulting in anger, and then rejecting the offers purely out of spite. Paluta and Merningham demonstrated that this reactive behavior occurs when an offer is dismissed simply because the other party is viewed as exploitative. Essentially, greed can trigger resentment or retaliation in counterparts. Whilst an awareness and understanding of the impacts of greed is an important first step to harness this during a negotiation, the key issue is being able to recognize when either you, your party, or your counterparty is being influenced by greed. As you might have guessed, greed is a trait that everyone demonstrates at some stage or another, but very few recognize it in themselves. It is also difficult to identify greed during a negotiation accurately, whether in yourself, a counterparty, or on your own team. In part, this is because it can be difficult to detect greed in a negotiation, since people do not usually present themselves as being greedy from the outset. They try to hide or disguise this emotion, given its common negative overtones, behind other overlapping motivations. In particular, it is crucial to distinguish greed from self-interest, which involves logically pursuing an outcome for self-benefit, whether of the individual or organization. Greed, in contrast, does not focus primarily on the pursuit of an outcome, but rather on the drive to accumulate more. It does so even if the behavior reduces the overall value on the table. To complicate matters, the more may not even be a tangible gain, but instead be for internal recognition, status, power, promotions, or because of an inherent organizational culture. Asking yourself a couple of key questions will help you to identify greed, either in a counterparty, your team, or yourself. First, consider what is driving the ask. Does it make commercial sense in the context? Is it responsible in creating value? Does it protect stakeholders and manage risk? Next, consider whether the definition of enough ever stabilizes. For example, if you meet one demand in the negotiation, does another shift? If every concession made becomes a platform for the next ask, it can be revealing as it suggests that greed is a driver for this behavior. If you pose a question such as, if we achieve X, what would success look like for you? And if either you or your counterpart cannot answer this question, you may not be negotiating towards a deal or a settlement. Another red flag for greed is when value extraction outweighs value creation in a negotiation. A healthy negotiation usually cares about the total value. Greed often takes the approach of how much of the pie can we capture, rather than how do we enlarge or sustain the pie in future. Resistance to principles and a return to positions should also raise an alarm bell. You should ask your counterparty or team member to help you understand their concern and position. However, if they loop back to "we want more of X" during the negotiations, then this is of concern as it suggests that they are not necessarily negotiating to principles. Scarcity language being used is also an indicator that a root problem in the negotiation may be greed. This is where you hear a lot of language regarding necessity or accumulation. The key challenge is not to diagnose greed too quickly. A lot of failed negotiations happen because one party assumes that the other is being greedy, when in fact they are, for example, protecting status, responding to incentives, anchoring aggressively, or under pressure for other unknown commercial reasons. Here, perception is particularly important, as greed also affects how negotiators perceive others. People consistently overestimate the extent to which counterparts are motivated by greed, which leads to defensive postures and inefficient negotiation behavior being adopted unnecessarily. It is also worth noting that greed, as an emotion, can manifest into two types of behavioral outcomes. The first, avarice, where someone has the urge to gain and possess as much as possible, and the second, miserliness, where a person does not want to lose or give away what they already have. These are two sides of the same coin. If you have identified that you are negotiating against a greedy negotiator, there is no one-size-fits-all solution to counter their behavior and biases. Instead, you might wish to take stock and seek to understand what may be driving the greed and try to reframe it. Don't try to negotiate against appetite. Instead, negotiate against incentives, as greed is not usually defeated by moral arguments. Instead, use boundaries, alternatives, reciprocity, and transparency.
While greed may feel empowering to the winning party, research has repeatedly shown that it often leads to suboptimal outcomes since negotiations involve trust, complexity, and often ongoing relationships. In short, greed can help you win in a negotiation, but that win will frequently come at a price. Greed makes you bleed. It is hard to self-analyze whether or not you need to harness and control greed in yourself or your own team. This is because greed in ourselves almost never feels like greed. Rather than thinking, what if it's me? We tend to rationalize the emotion, for example, thinking, I'm being thorough, or I have standards, or we're protecting the team and organization, or being commercially astute. This means that countering the influence of greed on your own behavior needs to be structural and addressed well in advance of a negotiation, when momentum, emotion, and other influences or pressures will kick in. As a starting point for self-reflection, write down and define what enough looks like to you. What is the outcome that you need? What is excellent or unnecessary? This reflection and framing should allow you to avoid recalibrating what success means in real time during the negotiation. You can also separate out stewardship from winning by asking yourself, if nobody knew I'd achieved X, would I still want it? This question can be uncomfortable as it seeks to strip away status, reputation, and the feeling of victory. Another tool is to try to measure the cost and not just the gain. Force yourself or your team to evaluate and score intangibles such as trust, future cooperation, team morale, or reputational impact. The idea is that once you see the hidden costs, the excessive gains aimed for may not appear to be worth it. As part of your negotiation preparations, you can also appoint someone to defend the opposite side. We mean this literally. Role play out the scenarios and seek to learn from them. Finally, try to notice your own emotional signals. These are the intrusive thoughts such as, I can get more, why should they have X, I don't want them to win, and most importantly, I deserve this, as these thought patterns can become dangerous if not balanced. As you can see, the primary mechanism for countering greed in yourself is by looking inward. Consider whether you have a fundamental driver and the why behind that. Is it to win? To be right? To control? If it is to win, then why? Is it because you want a promotion, a bonus, internal recognition? These are not necessarily negative objectives, as legitimate self-interest has its place. Wanting more in a negotiation is not the problem. Rather, it's the wanting more for more's sake. Ultimately, preparation and introspection is key, both to understand your underlying greed triggers and so that you can identify your stopping points. In summary, while self-interest is a natural part of bargaining, unchecked greed can lead to irrational decision-making, damaged relationships, and failed deals. It may also undermine the integrity of a negotiation through cognitive distortions, emotional backlash, and ethical compromises. By understanding its psychological roots, negotiators can balance assertiveness with fairness, ensuring sustainable agreements and preserving valuable relationships.
And that concludes our webinar. Hopefully that's given you a fresh perspective on both the influence of greed and how to manage it during a negotiation.
I've always liked to quote from Andy Stanley on greed when it comes to negotiations. He says, "Greed is not a financial issue, it's a heart issue." Hopefully you now agree with that statement in the context of negotiations.
The next and final webinar in our series is the first one not looking at a specific emotion in isolation. It looks at emotional intelligence more generally in the context of negotiations and promises to be a thought-provoking session. We hope that you will enjoy it.
In the meantime, we hope that you've enjoyed this webinar and that it has been useful. Thank you for watching.